Number 12. Sawed-off M1 carbine field conversions. The barrel is still hot enough to sting your palm. Somewhere beyond the tree line, a flare turns the jungle white. A man in a foxhole is sawing through a US M1 carbine he was issued by the Army itself. He is not destroying it. He is trying to make it work. The weapon entered the war as a lightweight compromise for officers, radio men, mortar crews, and paratroopers. It was already shorter than a full rifle. It was already meant for men who were never supposed to carry a Garand. But in caves, tank hatches, landing craft, and night patrols, even short could be too long. Troops started treating the carbine like raw material. They built homemade flash hiders, magazine rigs, sling-fed ammo carriers, even cut-down versions trimmed almost to pistol size. The battlefield kept forcing the same answer. The weapon that fit the fight was often the one no manual wanted to admit existed. It is 1945, humid, wet, and close. The kind of night that makes canvas, wood, and skin feel like the same material. The man braces the carbine across a sandbag and works the blade back and forth just behind the front band. Slow at first, then harder. Steel dust gathers on his wrist. Every few seconds he stops, listens, and looks toward the trees. The M1 carbine was never designed for this. On October 22, 1941, the Army adopted it as the United States Carbine Caliber .30 M1, built around a cartridge that sat between pistol and rifle power. Not a Garand, not a handgun, something lighter, easier to carry. By the fall of 1942, production was underway. By war's end, more than 6 million had come out of American factories. At that scale, a weapon stops being precious. Men in the field turn it into whatever they need. Here, that means shortening it by hand. He leans back into the saw. The teeth catch. The barrel answers with a faint metallic whine. Another man beside him holds a flashlight low inside his poncho to hide the beam, thumb pressed over half the lens. Between them lies the cut-off piece of wood from the forend, already split away, and 3 15-round magazines in a dirty pouch that looks stitched, restitched, and tied to the sling twice over. Out here, that matters. You do not throw these magazines away if you can help it. You keep them, refill them, tie them to the stock, tie them to the sling, stuff them into every pocket not already carrying bandages or cigarettes. A flare dies. The jungle drops back into black. Down here, a full-length rifle catches on everything. Roots, brush, the wall of a trench. A cave mouth that narrows just enough to stop your muzzle and start somebody else's bullet. The standard carbine is already compact, but compact depends on where you are. The airborne M1A1 folds to 25.5 inches with the stock tucked in. Even that can feel too long when you are hunched inside a vehicle hatch or turning sideways through coral and rock. So he keeps sawing. If short helps, shorter helps more. The barrel finally parts, and the cut piece drops into the mud with a dull tick. He picks up the weapon and stares at it for a second, maybe 2. Now it looks wrong. The proportions are off, more machine pistol than carbine. He runs his hand along the stump of the forend, then reaches for a file. Metal on metal, a small, steady scraping sound. He is careful with the front sight. That is the trick. Not to wreck the gun, but to leave enough barrel to keep the sight. Enough to aim, enough to fire, enough to pull the muzzle back inside the shape of the places he expects to fight in tomorrow. A tunnel, a bunker, the cramped lip of a landing craft, the inside of a tank. In places like that, an extra inch is not theory. It decides whether the weapon comes up clean or jams halfway on the wall. Around him, the rest of the position keeps breathing. Somebody coughs. Somebody mutters for a light. Farther down the line, somebody works a cleaning rod through a jammed action. By the late war, this is what the M1 carbine has become. Not just an issued arm with a manual and a neat assigned role, but a weapon men alter with whatever they have. A field-made flash hider here, an ammunition sling there, a magazine carrier stitched onto the stock. In one battalion table from August 1944, a parachute infantry battalion of 583 men could carry 310 M1A1 carbines, 280 Garands, only 18 Thompsons, and 2 pistols. The numbers make the point. Carbines were everywhere, so the improvisation spread with them. He tests the balance in one hand. Lighter now, faster in close quarters. But there is a price. The .30 carbine round was meant to leave an 18-inch barrel at about 1,990 feet per second with a 110-grain full metal jacket bullet. Cut the barrel down, and more disappears than steel. You lose velocity. You lose flash control. You strip away part of the tidy design engineers signed off on back in the States. The Army did not issue this version. No depot catalog lists it. No clean authorization trail follows it. Wartime photographs preserved in the archive show it anyway. A carbine reduced to near pistol size, still wearing enough barrel to hold its front sight like a stubborn little fact. The file stops. He wipes the muzzle with an oily rag, blackens his thumb with soot, and rubs the fresh metal dull so it will not catch the moon. Then he checks the action, pulls back, releases. The bolt slams forward with that hard, compact metallic snap unique to the carbine. He seats a magazine, 15 rounds. A weapon born as a compromise, remade for a fight at arm's length. The first test comes sooner than he planned. A shout runs down the line, not loud, not panicked. The kind of shout men use when they are trying not to wake the whole world. He turns, crouches, and moves with the shortened weapon tucked tight against his chest. No long muzzle reaching past the parapet, no buttstock dragging as he pivots. He slides through a gap in the revetment and drops into a communication trench where the walls are slick and narrow and shoulder width is suddenly a luxury. There, the cut stops looking strange. You see it in the movement first, the way the weapon clears the corner without scraping mud, the way it comes level without banging timber, the way he can keep his elbows in and still point the muzzle exactly where the trench bends. Nothing elegant about it, just pressure, distance, and a hacksaw in the dark. Because tomorrow's fight will happen too close for doctrine. He pauses at the next turn, listens, breathes once through his nose. Carbine is small enough now to ride almost under the armpit, quick enough to thrust forward like a pistol with a stock, but it still feeds from the same magazine, still throws the same cartridge, still carries the same US stamp on the receiver. Government issue, reshaped into something the government never officially made. Not a factory prototype, not a catalog model, a battlefield answer. By morning, in a photograph, it would look like a curiosity. The barrel was already in the mud. Number 11. Filed down full metal jacket bullets. On October 11, 1948, in the Curio House War Crimes Court in Hamburg, SS officer Fritz Knochlein sat before British judges and reached for a defense older than the war itself. His lawyers did not start with the machine guns. They did not start with the dead. They started with ammunition. They claimed British soldiers had used forbidden dum-dum rounds, illegal bullets, mutilated in the field to open up inside the body. It was a cold move and a calculated one. By 1948, everyone in that room knew the phrase carried legal poison all the way back to July 29, 1899, when the Hague Declaration banned bullets that expand or flatten easily in the human body. A rule written for metal and lead had become a language of outrage. Knochlein hoped that language might blur what happened in a French farmyard 8 years earlier. The man who made that defense matter was not Knochlein. It was Albert Pooley. On May 27, 1940, Pooley was a private with the 2nd Battalion, Royal Norfolk Regiment, one of the British units falling back toward Dunkirk through northern France. By then, the retreat had collapsed into shrinking pockets. Roads were cut, villages were shelled, fields burned at the edges. Near Le Paradis, Pooley and the men around him ended up holding a farm position already smashed by artillery and set alight. Walls were cracked, outbuildings burned, ammunition was running out by the hour. The battalion was cut off, but still firing. By that point, the day had narrowed to brick, smoke, and cartridge counts. Major Lyle Ryder kept the defense going as long as he could. By late afternoon, there was almost nothing left to fight with. Cloth went up. The order was surrender. For Pooley, that should have changed everything. Under the laws of war, he was supposed to move from target to prisoner in a single visible act. Rifle down, hands up, march out alive. That was the contract. It broke. Waffen-SS troops under Knöchlein took the prisoners away from the farm and marched them toward a wall. Around Pooley were dozens of exhausted British soldiers, Norfolk men, men from attached units, survivors of a position already pounded into ruin. Then the machine guns opened. 97 prisoners were killed. Pooley survived. So did William O'Callaghan. Almost everyone else in that line was shot down where he stood. The massacre ended in a field. The argument used to excuse it did not. The phrase dum-dum had that kind of reach. It came from Dum Dum Arsenal in India, where in 1896, British work on expanding rifle bullets helped give the world the name. By 1899, the taboo was formal. The Hague language did not ban a feeling or a reputation. It described a mechanism. Bullets whose hard envelope did not fully cover the core, or whose jacket had been cut or pierced so the lead underneath could deform more easily on impact. That matters because a filed-down full metal jacket round was the field hack version of the same logic. Take a legal service bullet. Damage the nose. Thin or strip the jacket. Expose or weaken the core. In theory, you have turned a standard round into something that mushrooms or tears wider in flesh. But only in theory. The ugly secret was that filed bullets were as much rumor and fear as reliable weapons. Soldiers in different wars talked about filing tips, notching jackets, even reversing bullets. Historical work on these hacks keeps hitting the same wall. They did not reliably improve performance. They could hurt accuracy. They could behave unpredictably. They could even create problems in the weapon itself. And ordinary pointed full metal jacket rounds could already tumble in tissue and leave wounds so ragged that angry men swore they must have come from forbidden ammunition. Battlefields did what battlefields always do. They mixed physics, panic, and revenge into one story. Pooley got trapped inside that story. After Le Paradis, he was not just a survivor, he was evidence. His testimony, along with O'Callaghan's, helped establish what happened after the surrender. But when Knöchlein finally faced trial in Hamburg, the defense tried to drag the dead backward through a legal loophole. If the British had used illegal bullets, the implication ran, then the SS men had been enraged by unlawful conduct. Not justified exactly. The defense could not make that leap cleanly, but muddied, confused, made human by combat fury. The accusation was useful for a reason. It sounded technical, specific, and monstrous all at once. Filed bullets fit perfectly, small enough to hide in a pocket, serious enough to stain an entire unit. Even if only a few soldiers ever actually filed down full metal jacket rounds in World War II, everyone understood the charge. To be caught with altered ammunition was to risk being seen not as a normal enemy soldier, but as someone using outlawed methods. Sometimes the thing being banned does not need to be common. It only needs to be believable. Filed nose on a bullet could do less damage in flesh than men imagined, but far more damage in law, in rumor, and in the mercy an enemy might or might not extend. Pooley's survival forced the court back to the only point that mattered. Even if British troops had used prohibited ammunition, and the court did not need to prove they had, surrendered prisoners could not be marched to a wall and machine-gunned without trial. The legal argument collapsed under the bodies it was meant to step over. Knöchlein was convicted and later executed. What survived was not proof of widespread filed bullets in the campaign, not a neat record showing how often frontline soldiers actually did it. What survived was the accusation itself, hanging there between wound and reprisal, useful precisely because it was hard to measure. In the First World War, Germans had already accused the British .303 Mark VII of being designed so its tip could be broken off into a dum-dum, and later research found no substance to that charge. The charge endured because it explained too much too quickly. A terrible wound, a hated enemy, a forbidden trick. Case closed. At Le Paradis, the bullet in the courtroom was not really on trial. Pooley had seen what was. Men who had surrendered were killed anyway. All the old language about mutilated rounds, banned jackets, exposed cores, and battlefield fury could not make that disappear. In the end, the forbidden hack mattered less for what it did to flesh than for what men claimed it let them do to each other. Pooley lived long enough to say what the dead could not, and the court record reduced the entire defense to its true size. If such ammunition had been used, the law still stood. Number 10. Reversed rifle bullets. On September 15, 1916, near Flers-Courcelette on the Somme, a German infantryman looked through smoke and mist and saw something that should not have been there. It weighed 28 tons. It carried a crew of 8. It moved at 3.7 miles per hour, barely faster than a man could walk. Rifle fire did little to it. Machine gun fire did little to it. It kept coming, iron-plated, ugly, and new. British Mark I tanks had entered combat for the first time that morning. 49 were intended for the attack. 32 reached the start line. Only 18 went into action. The number that mattered was not 49 or 18. It was the shock. What followed became one of those battlefield legends that sounds too crude to be real and too practical to disappear. German soldiers faced armor too thin to ignore and too thick for ordinary rounds. They took standard 7.92mm rifle bullets and seated them backward in the cartridge case, point to the rear, flat base to the front. Then they fired them at tanks. The myth is simple: a desperate trick, a backward bullet that drilled through steel, a peasant fix for a machine-age problem. It sounds improvised, brutal, and slightly insane, so it outlived the tanks it was meant to stop. Start with the plate. 12 millimeters. That was the Mark I's armor, according to the Tank Museum. Not 30, not 50, 12. It could shrug off ordinary small arms fire, but this was still early war armor, closer to a hardened skin than a fortress wall. This story belongs before anti-tank warfare had really been invented. It does not belong to the age of thick, sloped World War II tanks. Now the bullet. The round usually tied to the trick is the German 7.92 by 57 Mauser. In normal form, it flies point first, stabilizes properly, and punches into soft targets the way rifle bullets are meant to. Reverse it, and most of that goes away. Aerodynamics get worse, accuracy gets worse. The shot becomes a pure hack, not refined, not reliable, just an attempt to make one part of the impact nastier. That part was not always penetration. This is where the popular version starts to slip. Against thin plate, the flat base hitting first could deliver a sharper blow to the metal. Sometimes that meant cracking, denting, or stressing the plate in ways that mattered even if the round did not make a clean hole. Inside a tank, a clean hole was only half the problem. The other half was spall. You are inside a Mark I. It is loud, hot, full of engines, fumes, metal, and men. Then something slams into the outside. The bullet may not come through. The inside face of the armor spits fragments anyway. Tiny shards, razor-edged flakes. The tank's own wall turns into shrapnel. That is the core of this weapon. Not a magic armor piercer, not a secret super round. A way to make thin armor dangerous from the inside out. Some armies tried to ban or bury the things that worked best because what worked was often ugly, local, and halfway between ammunition and improvisation. The evidence gets messier the closer you look. Some accounts describe reversed bullets as a frontline expedient, modified by soldiers who needed something, anything, that might hurt a tank now. Other summaries blur them together with early German anti-tank ammunition, as if they were standard issue from the start. That distinction matters. Factory-loaded anti-armor round is one story. Men on the line pulling bullets, reseating them backward, and gambling with pressure, accuracy, and effect is another. The record does not settle it cleanly. Collectors, ammunition historians, and later summaries point in different directions. Some examples existed as loaded rounds. Some of the reputation may have grown in the retelling. Battlefield hacks do that. One real practice becomes 10 confident anecdotes because the story feels right. A tank appears. Infantry, panic. Somebody reverses a bullet. The image is vivid enough to outrun the paperwork. Even if you grant the strongest version of the tale, the timeline shows what came next. By 1917, the stopgap was already being overtaken. Germany introduced purpose-built armor-piercing ammunition, including the K bullet. That gives us firmer ground. Against 12 to 13 millimeters of armor at up to 100 meters, it had roughly a 1 in 3 chance of penetration. Not certainty, not a miracle. Just a bullet designed for the job instead of argued into it. Then the rifles got larger. JFC Fuller wrote that the first German anti-tank rifle was captured at Hamel on July 4, 1918. His description is blunt. 5 feet 6 inches long, 36 pounds in weight, .530 caliber. By that point, the battlefield had already moved on. Infantry were no longer trying to bully armor with a reversed service round. They were carrying weapons built specifically to kill the machine. That is the part the legend usually hides. In a World War II setting, reversed bullets sound like another desperate anti-tank trick for crews and riflemen facing steel monsters. By 1942, that world was gone. Medium and heavy tanks wore armor far beyond the Mark I's 12 millimeters. A T-34 carried 45 millimeters on front and side, a Sherman, 51 and 38. Panzer IIIs ran from 30 to 50. Panzer IVs could reach 80 on the front. Against that, the old reversed bullet idea was not terrifying. It was antique. Even real anti-tank rifles were broadly losing relevance by then. A backward-seated rifle bullet was not a forbidden World War II wonder weapon. It was the ghost of a First World War panic, dragged forward into a new war that had already outgrown it. The story is not false. It is specific. A slow tank comes out of the mist in 1916. Ordinary rounds fail. Men reach for a crude answer. The bullet strikes outside, but the blood comes from inside. The tale lasted because, for one brief moment, it found a seam in a machine no one yet knew how to fight. Then that seam closed. Purpose-built armor-piercing rounds replaced the trick. Anti-tank rifles replaced the guesswork. Shaped charges and rocket launchers replaced both. By the Second World War, the reversed bullet survived mostly as a rumor with a date attached to it. A famous workaround from the hour when tanks were new and nobody had proper tools yet. But on that September morning in 1916, proper tools were exactly what the Germans did not have. They had rifles. They had tanks in front of them. And somewhere on that line, under smoke, mud, and incoming fire, someone was forcing a cartridge into place the wrong way round, while the armor kept coming. Number 9. Trench shotgun use in the Pacific. On September 19, 1944, 4 days after the landing on Peleliu, Marines from the 5th Marines moved into the island's eastern peninsula with war dog sections out in front. Not across open beach, into ridges, mangroves, cave mouths, and the kind of broken ground where you do not see the ambush until you are already inside it. The official Marine history records what happened in the 3/5 sector with unusual precision. An ambush was there, the dogs warned in time, and the surprise was effectively thwarted. A point element moves forward by yards. A dog catches scent or sound first. A handler gets seconds, not minutes. In one Peleliu Marine Corps photo caption, that handler is carrying a pump shotgun. Start with the gun. The numbers tell you why it appears here. The classic Winchester Model 1897 trench configuration was a 12-gauge pump with a 20-inch cylinder bore barrel, short barrel, open choke. 5 shells in the magazine, 1 more in the chamber, 6 total before reloading. At jungle distance, that matters more than elegance. The cylinder bore does not try to hold a tight pattern for long range. Long range is not the job. The job is the first burst of violence at the edge of sight, at the mouth of a cave, through brush, over a dog's shoulders, in the 2 or 3 seconds after warning. Now the mechanism. The Model 1897 had no trigger disconnector. Hold the trigger back and work the slide, and the gun fires each time the action closes. Later, shooters called it slam firing. In a range demonstration, that sounds theatrical. In blind ground, it is arithmetic. 1 pull, Pump, fire. Pump, fire. As fast as the shooter can keep the muzzle under control. Not for careful marksmanship. For the first man through a gap who needs maximum effect before the target disappears behind coral, roots, or rock. The hardware around the barrel says the same thing. The trench version carried a ventilated steel handguard and bayonet adapter for the M1917 bayonet. The handguard was there because a 12-gauge barrel heats fast when you cycle it hard. The bayonet lug was there because 6 shells is not infinity. In close country, plans collapse to arm's length. Details that look ceremonial in a catalog turn practical when the range drops to steps instead of yards. Peleliu also shows what the shotgun was not. It was not primarily a dueling weapon in the Pacific, not a dramatic badge of trench raiding carried over unchanged from 1918. On this island, it looks more like a guardrail for a fragile process. Dog first, men second. Warning first, shotgun second. The official account says the dogs in the 3/5 sector detected an ambush before the Marines walked into it. The shotgun belongs to the instant after detection, when everyone knows something is there, but almost nobody knows exactly where. The ground matters more than the legend. Peleliu was not a battlefield of long, clean lines. After September 15th, the fight moved off beaches and airfield approaches into compartments. Ridge folds, reverse slopes, caves, mangrove pockets, small unit ambush country. A rifle gives reach, but reach is wasted if the target flashes up at 10 feet and vanishes. A submachine gun throws volume, but it depends on controllable bursts and a steady feed of pistol-caliber ammunition. The pump shotgun, loaded with buckshot, turns one hit problem into a pattern problem. At very short range, that is a different kind of insurance. Then the limits close in. A shotgun shell is bulky. 6 in the gun sounds useful until you ask how many a man can actually carry through heat, coral dust, and jungle moisture. The 2nd Marine Division's table of organization and equipment called for 490 combat shotguns. That is a substantial planned presence, not a novelty. Planned presence is not the same as smooth supply. Pacific conditions expose the weak point fast. Paper shotgun shells could swell in the wet. Swollen hulls do not chamber cleanly. They do not extract cleanly. At the worst possible moment, they turn a short-range emergency weapon into dead weight. Standardization pushed toward the M19 brass buckshot round because brass tolerated that moisture better. The Pacific adaptation was not just that Marines brought a banned-looking World War I weapon into jungle fighting. They kept adapting around a weapon that solved one problem brilliantly and created several others right after. Limited reach, bulky ammunition, awkward carrying methods, moisture-sensitive paper hulls unless you had the brass loads. Even identification gets slippery. In many wartime photos, captions simply say, "Pump shotgun," not "Winchester 1897" or "Model 12." And later, identification often comes from tiny visual cues. That matters because by World War II, the shotgun in U.S. service was already broader than one famous pattern. Firearms historian summaries note that 61,104 Winchester Model 12 shotguns were delivered to the U.S. during the war, and these are often described as seeing combat, especially in the Pacific. Picture one single iconic trench gun, and the paperwork starts undoing the image. Even terminology drifts. In World War II manuals, the clean official term was often not trench gun at all. Sources reviewing the manuals note designations like M97 riot-type guns, including guns collectors now group under trench guns. Riot type in the manual. Cave-edge weapon in practice. That gap carries the whole point. Strip away the myth, and the shotgun's Pacific role becomes brutally specific. 20-inch barrel, 12-gauge bore, 5+1, no disconnector, warning from a dog, one narrow trail, one patch of mangroves, one ambush detected just before it closes. The gun is not there to dominate a battlefield. It is there to win the first 3 seconds in a place where 3 seconds decides whether the patrol keeps moving at all. In the manuals, it could be a riot-type gun with ugly logistics and limited range. On the ground at Peleliu, it was what you handed the man walking into the blind spot. Number 8. Welrod suppressed pistol. In September 1943, inside the Washington Navy Yard, American officers examined a British weapon that barely looked like a weapon at all. Laid out on a bench in pieces, it was a steel tube, a few blunt fittings, and a detachable box magazine. Assemble it, and it became something else. A suppressed pistol built to fire at arm's length, slip into a pocket, and leave almost nothing behind but one body. From July to September that year, the U.S. Naval Gun Factory tested it with Army and Marine experts. They did not adopt it as a service sidearm. They accepted it for special applications, under a name so sterile it sounded like office equipment, Mark I hand-firing device. The label was bland. The purpose was not. This thing was built for the narrowest kind of violence in the war. Not firefights, not raids with a dozen men. One doorway, one sentry, one collaborator walking home after dark. One shot, maybe two, at about 8 yards or less. Then gone. Picture occupied Europe in late 1943. A railway line has to be sabotaged before dawn. 3 resistance members wait in an alley beside a goods yard. The problem is not the tracks. The problem is the single guard at the side gate, 40 years old, smoking to stay awake, 10 steps from the lock. A normal pistol sends a crack down the street. Windows open, dogs start barking. A patrol comes looking. A knife turns the struggle into its own alarm. Do nothing, and the line stays open. The train gets through, and somebody else dies tomorrow because supplies arrived on time. The whole mission, with all its planning and explosives and couriers, contracts to one ugly requirement: get close enough to remove one man quietly. That was the job the Welrod was built for. In July 1940, after France fell, Britain created the Special Operations Executive for sabotage and resistance in occupied Europe. Churchill wanted Europe set ablaze, but fires needed tools: radios, plastic explosive, forged papers, and weapons for people who could not fight in uniform. At Station 9, near Welwyn in Hertfordshire, SOE researchers began building exactly those tools. Some were clever, some were bizarre. Major Hugh Q.A. Reeves took one of the simplest requirements of all: kill one person without announcing it to the neighborhood, and answered it with one of the strangest pistols of the war. It was called the Welrod. Well linked it to the Welwyn family of secret devices, which tells you the sort of world it came from. A bureaucracy of sabotage where even names were meant to blur. The Americans pushed that further. Hand-firing device was not just dull, it was verbal camouflage. If the weapon worked best when nobody noticed it, the paperwork aimed for the same effect. The object itself followed the same logic. Overall length, about 310 millimeters. Long for a pistol, but that extra length was the point, because much of the body was an integral suppressor. It was chambered mainly in .32 ACP, or 7.65 millimeter, and 9 millimeter parabellum. The shape was brutally plain. No elegant grip frame, no dramatic silhouette. The removable magazine doubled as the grip. Without that grip in place, the rest of the weapon lost much of its pistol profile. And down, it could pass for something closer to a bicycle pump or an odd mechanical tube than a firearm. That was not a novelty. It was operational design. An agent moving through a checkpoint, a safe house, or a bicycle repair shop did not just need a small gun. He needed a gun that might not register as a gun in the half-second glance that decides whether a search becomes serious. Its real trick was not invisibility. It was discipline. The Welrod was not forgiving. It was a manually operated, very short-range instrument meant for deliberate use. You got close. Very close. Imperial War Museum's records put its effective operational range at around 8 yards. That is not from across the room distance. That is across the room. Hallway distance, bedside distance, courtyard distance. The kind of distance where you can see what the other man's hands are doing. So this was never a wonder weapon. It solved one problem brilliantly, and only one. It let clandestine operators do the thing a resistance war kept demanding and conventional armies hated admitting: selective killing at intimate range. without the blast and signature of an ordinary pistol. Armies prefer weapons that can sit in manuals, parades, and procurement tables. The Welrod belonged somewhere else. It was made for jobs nobody wanted described in a communique. That helps answer the larger pattern hanging over weapons like this. The tools that worked best were often the ones institutions tried hardest to ban, bury, or rename. Sometimes worked best meant they were best at the part of war everybody needed and nobody wanted spoken aloud. In 1943, Birmingham Small Arms was producing Welrods, and at least one crossed the Atlantic for American evaluation. The U.S. tests at the Washington Navy Yard are one of those moments where secrecy still leaves fingerprints. For 2 months, from July into September, specialists examined a British assassination pistol and decided it had a place. Not a broad one, not for line infantry, for special applications. The phrase is bloodless. Secret institutions often use bloodless language when they approve something morally specific. How many Welrods were actually produced is still muddy. Museum and reference sources often repeat about 2,800 pistols. Other discussions push much higher numbers. That uncertainty is not surprising. Secrecy obscures records, contracts blur, wartime production trails disappear. But even the lower estimate tells you what this was. Not mass issue, not thousands upon thousands for regular troops, but a narrow tool for a narrow mission. And narrow fits the human reality too. Picture the shot this weapon was built around. Not a charging squad, not a dramatic duel. You are in a stairwell, or behind a hedge, or beside a loading gate in rain. The pistol is a dull cylinder in your hand. The distance is not measured in battlefield terms. It is measured in steps. One guard turns, one breath, one muffled mechanical cough instead of a crack. Then the body folds with a noise somehow louder than the shot. Popular memory often scrubs that part away. Suppressed weapons in films look glamorous, almost frictionless. The Welrod was the opposite. Crude-looking, specialized, claustrophobic. Forced the user into the worst possible range because silence had a price, and the price was proximity. Years later, under museum glass, it can look almost disappointing. Too plain. Too small in ambition, too ugly to carry legend. But that plain tube was one of the clearest field hacks of the war. Strip a pistol down to the single illegal-seeming function the mission actually needs. Hide the meaning in the shape, hide the purpose in the paperwork, and send it into occupied streets. It was not built to win battles. It was built to erase one person so a larger plan could keep moving. In the dark, with the magazine removed, it still looks less like a famous weapon than a tool someone forgot to put away. Number 7. Booby-trapped souvenir weapons. On February 5, 1945, in Oberhoffen-sur-Moder, France, a U.S. Army photographer caught a scene that looks almost absurd until you understand the war behind it. A soldier stands off to one side of an abandoned German bazooka. He is not holding it. He is not admiring it. He is testing it with a long wire, like a man about to set off a charge from a safe distance. The weapon is already useless to the Germans. The fight has moved on. The danger has not. By 1945, Allied troops had learned that an enemy weapon could do its job twice, once in combat and again after being abandoned when somebody bent down to claim it. The wire in that photograph shows how far that suspicion had spread. A battlefield souvenir was no longer a trophy. It was a drill. It sounds paranoid until you read the paperwork. In February 1945, the U.S. Intelligence Bulletin, Volume 3, Number 6, warned American troops that Germans sometimes concealed a small explosive charge inside the mechanism of a rifle or a Luger pistol, then left the weapon where a soldier would be tempted to pick it up. The trap was simple and brutal. A man sees a prize. He presses the trigger to test it. The souvenir detonates in his hands. The document does not treat curiosity as a side issue. It treats curiosity as the firing mechanism. This is not the same thing as a mine in a road or a charge under a bridge. Those attack movement. This one waits for appetite. It waits for the moment after the danger seems to have passed. That is when discipline loosens and greed, pride, or plain excitement takes over. Every American knew what a captured Luger meant. It was compact, expensive-looking, unmistakably German. It was the handgun men wrote home about. If you wanted to turn one object into a tiny delayed ambush, you picked the thing the other side most wanted to keep. The records get murkier when you ask the forensic question. How many souvenir guns were truly booby-trapped inside the weapon itself, with a charge hidden in the mechanism? How many were rigged more crudely, with wire and attached explosives nearby? The warning is real. The fear is real. The surviving battlefield evidence is thinner than the rumor, but the effect was there either way. Once the possibility entered the manuals, every easy trophy became suspect. The weapon still worked, even when it was only, maybe, there. Europe was only half the story. Before the invasion of Saipan in 1944, Marine intelligence circulated guidance on Japanese booby traps that reads less like a list of explosives than a list of human habits. Rifles, corpses, bottles, trunks, tobacco tins, parasols, flashlights, matchboxes, clocks, vehicles. The range is the point, not one kind of object. Anything a tired man might touch, open, move, pocket, inspect, or salvage. The Japanese had understood the same thing the Germans had and pushed it further. A trap did not have to block your path. It only had to meet your hand. On Tinian, in July 1944, U.S. Army historians described that logic inside a much larger defensive system. White Beach 2 had more than 100 horned mines. Yellow Beach 1 had 23 more. This was not a battlefield of isolated tricks thrown together at random. It was layered denial. Sea approaches mined, landing zones covered, inland areas prepared. Among those defenses, booby traps turned up in beer cases, watches, and souvenir items scattered beyond the beaches. That detail matters because it shifts the trap away from the obvious military target. Not the tank, not the landing craft. The man who thinks the dangerous part is over. A watch is a perfect example. It is tiny, personal, intimate. You do not blast it from 20 yards away. You pick it up in your fingers. You turn it over. Maybe you imagine sending it home. The object does two jobs at once. It promises a reward, and it forces contact. These traps feel especially ugly, even in a war full of ugly ideas, because they are built for the pause after survival. There was hardware behind that psychology too. American handbooks on Japanese forces noted that the Model 23 grenade was suitable for booby traps because of its pull-type ignition and the side lugs that made anchoring easy. The trap did not require some exotic secret device. It could be built out of a standard grenade, a line, a fixed point, and one accurately predicted human motion. Open the lid, lift the rifle, move the bottle. The rest is mechanics. The Navy's 1944 booby trap pamphlet made the same lesson painfully broad. The German S-mine was described as one of the most deadly and commonly encountered anti-personnel traps, but the pamphlet's larger warning was worse. Almost anything able to hold a charge could become a trap. That sounds generic until you place it beside the photograph from Oberhofen zur Moderne. Then it turns specific. A bazooka, a pistol, a beer crate, a watch. The war is teaching soldiers to distrust objects, not just ground. That reaches beyond casualties. It slows hands, alters routine. It turns scavenging into ordnance work. A man sees a handsome enemy pistol. Instead of pocketing it, he backs away and calls for somebody with tools, or string, or simply more nerve. Even when the trap never fires, it still extracts a cost in time, attention, and confidence. That helps explain a larger pattern running through this war. The weapons that worked best were often the ones armies tried hardest to ban or bury. Worked best did not always mean killing the most men in one blast. Sometimes it meant moving into the mind of every man who survived the last one. There is one more thing hidden in that 1945 warning. It aimed at a very specific fantasy. Not food for the starving, not water for the desperate. Souvenirs, proof, ownership. The little private ceremony by which a soldier turns enemy property into his story. These traps weaponized that ceremony. They turned victory memorabilia into a final line of defense. So look again at that photograph from France. Not just caution, doctrine. The object itself has become untrustworthy. A soldier with a wire and an abandoned bazooka is not checking junk. He is testing whether the war has really ended in that patch of ground. Sometimes it had not. A souvenir could still explode. Number 6. Booby-trapped corpses and wounded decoys. You go down the steps first because somebody has to. Basement. Cold masonry. A dead German on the floor. No movement. No rifle in his hands. No drama left in him at all. Your brain starts to relax. The fight moved on. This is cleanup now. Search the room. Check the body. Take the papers. Confirm who he was. Then the room reminds you that none of those actions are safe. On December 12, 1944, in Jungersdorf, Germany, Staff Sergeant Dwight P. Ellett of the U.S. Army Signal Corps photographed one of the ugliest little lessons of the war. Retreating Germans had left a dead soldier in a basement, and explosive material was visible near the corpse. The body was not simply a casualty. It was bait for the first American who did the normal thing. Touch him, roll him over, check his tunic, move him out of the way. In that room, basic decency had been turned into a trigger. It sounds too cruel to be standard. But by June 1943, U.S. intelligence officers were already warning troops in Europe that German retreat zones had booby-trapped almost every conceivable type of movable object. Doors, drawers, documents, flashlights, and, in the bulletin's own words, even the bodies of their own dead. This was not a nightmare invented afterward. The warning came first. Then the photographs caught up to it. Here the logic of the field hack mutates. A mine in the road kills the man who steps there. A trap on a corpse goes after the man who stops, the man who helps, the man who investigates. It punishes the instincts armies need to keep functioning: curiosity, procedure, mercy, proof. You can feel what that does to a unit in about 5 seconds. Somebody shouts, "Body in the cellar!" And now nobody wants to be the first one through the door. Not because they are cowards, because the war has taught them that dead is not the same thing as safe. Every movement slows down. Every pocket becomes suspicious. Every hand hovers. The floor, the walls, the desk, the body itself, all of it has to be read like a puzzle. Ellett's photograph belonged to the 9th Infantry Division under 1st U.S. Army, and even the paperwork around the image tells its own story. It was first passed as censored on December 15, 1944, then later cleared by SHAEF without censorship restrictions on April 16, 1945. The image moved from something too sensitive to show freely to something important enough to circulate. By then, the lesson was bigger than one basement in one German town. Soldiers needed to see what retreat warfare had become. The corpse trap was only half of it. Train men to fear the dead, and the next move is to use the living body the same way. On March 16, 1945, on Iwo Jima, an Associated Press photograph captured the same idea in a different form. A Japanese soldier had lain in a shell hole for a day and a half, apparently dead or disabled. 1.5 days. Long enough to become part of the landscape. Long enough for anyone approaching to lower the guard just a little. Inches from his hand was a live grenade. That detail changes the whole scene. You are not looking at a wounded man waiting to be rescued. You are looking at a decision forced onto the rescuers. Is he helpless? Is he acting? Is there one grenade? Are there more under him? If you step closer, are you helping a casualty or entering the kill zone he built with his own body? The AP caption says Marines removed the grenade first. Then they still feared further traps beneath him. Even after the obvious danger was taken away, the body itself remained suspect. They did not rush in and lift him out. They dragged him out only after he promised not to resist. Promised. On a battlefield, that is not a safety device. It is desperation wrapped in language. The Marines were dealing with a human being at arm's length, like he might be a live shell, because experience had taught them he might as well be. The tempo of the war changes here. Before, you were checking objects, souvenirs, weapons, crates, abandoned gear. Now the same suspicion spreads to bodies, and that is a darker threshold. An object can be distrusted without moral cost. A body cannot. Once a soldier has to look at a corpse and think wire, or look at a wounded man and think decoy, something important has been damaged, even if nothing explodes. This also answers a question running through the whole war. Why were the weapons that worked best so often the ones they tried hardest to ban or bury? Because worked did not just mean blast radius, it meant corrupting reflex. A good forbidden field hack made the enemy hesitate before touching a door. A better one made him hesitate before touching a human being. You can see why armies hated this, not just because it was brutal, but because it spread contamination through everything around it. Medics, burial details, intelligence men, search parties, engineers, riflemen clearing houses. They had to assume the same thing. The scene in front of you may be staged for your habits. Even when the trap was not there, the caution remained, and that caution cost minutes, sometimes hours, sometimes trust. There is another twist. These tricks were cheap. No factory breakthrough, no miracle alloy, no new aircraft program. Just explosives, timing, nerve, and a very clear understanding of what the other side would do next. That made them hard to regulate and even harder to erase. You could ban a class of weapon on paper. You could not ban a man from tying death to instinct in a basement and walking away. So the battlefield starts to feel poisoned in a new way, not chemically, behaviorally. The obvious threats are still there, but the hidden ones are now inside routine itself. Search the dead, aid the wounded, clear the room. Those are how an army moves forward. Here, each one becomes a gamble. These images matter because they lock the pattern in place. Jungersdorf is not just a photograph of a dead German soldier in a cellar. Iwo Jima is not just a photograph of a wounded Japanese soldier in a shell hole. Put them together, and they show the same weapon in two forms. One dead, one alive. Both built around the same idea. Use the enemy's humanity as the fuse. By the time a soldier learns that lesson once, the trick has already done its best work. The next body he sees will not be just a body. The next wounded man will not be just wounded. The damage is already done. A Japanese soldier who had lain in a shell hole for 1.5 days, apparently dead or disabled, had a live grenade near his hand. Number 5. Shoe Mine 42 Wooden Anti-Personnel Mine. On July 5, 1944, in Bayeux, a Royal Engineers sapper from No. 1 Dog Platoon, 277th Field Park Company, stands for an Army film and photographic unit camera with his dog at his side. The town is in Allied hands now. The ground around it is not. Road verges, orchard edges, battered tracks, weeds by a gatepost. All of it has to be treated as if it might lift and tear a man apart. The sapper holds still for the photograph. The dog does not. Head low, short steps, nose working through wet grass and churned dirt. You can see why they brought him here. The easy mines are gone first. What remains is smaller and quieter. A mine that barely speaks to the tool built to find mines. Somewhere ahead, under a skin of soil so thin it barely changes the color of the earth, sits a Shoe Mine 42. It is almost insultingly small. About 4.72 inches long, 3.55 inches wide, 1.77 inches deep. Barely 1.1 pounds in total. A little box, sometimes wood. Sometimes a compressed fiber material, hard as dense cardboard. A lid just over 5 inches long fitted on top. Inside, roughly 200 grams of TNT, 7.25 ounces, enough for exactly the job it was built to do. Not a tank killer, not a crater maker, Enough to take the next boot, the next leg, the next man who has to go first. The sapper follows the dog. He moves slowly enough to make slowness feel dangerous. Normandy in July is hedges and trapped sightlines. Grass has grown back over places shelled only weeks earlier. Every field is littered with metal that is not a mine. Fragments, cartridge cases, splinters from tools, wire, cans, torn fittings from wagons and trucks. That is what makes this little German trick so vicious. A normal detector can find metal. This thing hardly gives it any to find. The mine needs only a small WW2 igniter and a number 8 detonator to wake the charge. The rest is box and explosive. Cheap materials, minimum signal. So the detector operator has to bring the head low, lower, almost kissing the soil. Every time it twitches over a scrap of battlefield junk, the whole line has to hesitate. Not because that signal means death, because it might. That is the rhythm now. Sweep, pause, probe, shift, sweep again. A machine built to restore certainty is reduced to suspicion. The dog stops. Not dramatically. No bark, no leap. Just a change in the body. Nose fixed on one patch of ground near the margin of a track where wagon wheels and boots have already passed. The sapper sees it at once. His hand comes up. Everyone behind him freezes in whatever posture they were caught in that second. A half step, a bent knee. A shoulder turned to whisper. Suddenly even breathing feels like movement. They are staring at ordinary dirt. No metal prongs go in blindly. No one steps closer for a better look. The sapper kneels off to one side and works the earth with the care of a man opening a watch that might detonate if he loses patience. First the grass, then the top crust of soil. Then a shape appears. Not like a bomb, not like the steel body men expect. A small buried case, squared and mean in its plainness. It does not even look expensive enough to fear. A standard German transport crate could carry 20 of these mines empty, with detonators and charges moved separately. That is what the ground can become. Not one trap, not one marked pocket of danger. A pattern. A field sown with dozens of near-invisible wounds, each one assembled fast, buried fast, and forgotten by the man who laid it, because he does not need to watch it work. The next infantryman will do that for him. Or the next sapper. The mine is aimed at the act of clearing mines itself. The dog edges back slightly as the sapper exposes more of the lid. A rectangle now. Fiber or wood darkened by damp soil. He knows what should be under it. A pressure lid over the igniter, the little Bakelite WW42 arranged so that weight does the rest. Step on the top, press it down, trigger the detonator. The TNT blows upward from below ankle height. For a man walking point, that is enough. For the men behind him, it means a stoppage, a casualty, a cry for a medic, a lane closed where a lane was supposed to open. Someone behind the camera shifts position. For an instant, the photograph comes back. The neat pose, the dog beside the sapper. The tidy caption that will outlive this morning. The image leaves out the real sensation. Everybody here is being pushed back into older senses. Nose before coil, instinct before instrument. The battlefield has gone too quiet for the machine, so men have brought an animal to read what steel cannot. The sapper clears one edge, then another. The box is shallow, barely deeper than a man's palm across the knuckles. He cannot rush, because the mine was built for rushing men. He cannot trust appearances, because appearances are the trick. He cannot fully trust the detector hanging useless for this job. The detector is not broken. It is being asked to find almost nothing in a landscape full of noise. That is where the dog matters. Not as a mascot, not as comfort, as a workaround. A few more careful scrapes and the outline is complete. Small, crude, concealed so cheaply it feels offensive. No elaborate mechanism, no engineering masterpiece, just a buried box and the knowledge that most armies advance by searching the ground with metal and confidence. Remove enough of the metal, and confidence goes with it. The sapper leans closer, His fingers stop inches from the lid. Beneath the dirt, where the pressure top meets the igniter, the shoe mine is finally visible for what it is, hidden not by power, but by absence. He starts to lift more soil from the front edge. Then the dog snaps its head toward a second patch of grass 3 yards to the left. Number 4. Glasmine 43 Non-Metallic Anti-Personnel Mine. On April 5, 2009, Eifel National Park Ranger Roland Volgarten stopped a group of visitors at the edge of the woods near Vogelzang and told them not to leave the marked path. The Belgian military had already given up the area. The training ground had closed at the end of 2005. The park had opened to the public in early 2006. Families could walk here again. Birdwatchers could come back. The forest looked ordinary. Volgarten was warning them about a weapon designed in late 1944 when Germany's mine war hit 2 limits at once. Allied troops were sweeping roads and fields with mine detectors. German industry was running short of metal. The answer was not a giant secret weapon. It was smaller than a dinner bowl. A glass body, roughly 4.5 inches across at the base and 6 inches at the top, with a standard 200-gram demolition charge tucked inside. A mine built to vanish in the soil and slip past the logic of how men searched for mines. He was not talking about rusting shells you could spot with a careful eye. He was talking about something that could still sit under leaves and roots and give back almost nothing to an ordinary detector. The war was over. The trick remained. Walk into that landscape with him and everything looks calm. Wind moves through the branches. Birds carry across the trees. Maybe you hear distant footsteps on gravel. There is no cratered moonscape, no blasted tree line. Just a protected park with rules that feel slightly too strict for a Sunday walk. Stay on the path. Do not wander. Do not cut across the grass. 65 years earlier, someone had solved a battlefield problem by turning cupboard materials into a bomb. The Glasmine 43 was simple in the ugliest possible way. A small glass bowl held the explosive charge. On top sat fragile glass plates, including a shear plate around 1/32 of an inch thick and a thicker pressure plate that reached about 1/4 inch at its maximum. Step on it with roughly 40 pounds in one American Ordnance catalog, or 20 to 25 pounds in a wartime technical manual, and the thin plate broke. Then the fuse did the rest. In some versions, the break tripped a mechanical igniter. In others, it crushed a chemical igniter. The foot came down first. Understanding arrived later. Roland Volgarten was dealing with the afterimage of that decision. Not the laying of the mines, not combat footage. The residue. A workaround that kept controlling bodies decades after the men who buried it were gone. Official maps could tell you this zone had once been military terrain. Belgian records could tell you glass mines were known to be present. The ground itself gave back almost nothing. No obvious metal mass, no clean, confident sweep. In 2009, a ranger had to speak with the caution of a sapper. The design explains the absolute tone of that warning. The glass mine was non-metallic, but the phrase sounds more advanced than the thing really was. It was a materials workaround. Germany did not need to spend precious metal on a pressure mine body if glassworks could do the job instead. The explosive inside was not exotic. It used a common Sprengkörper 28 demolition block, 200 grams. The clever part was logistical, not glamorous. Save strategic materials, keep production moving. The front with something cheap, compact, and hard to detect. Cheap mattered. Scale mattered too. By the last phase of the war, production figures reached about 11 million, with some 9.7 million still in stock when the war ended. Those are not boutique numbers. They are not an experimental curiosity. This was a system. A weapon made in quantities large enough to outlive the state that ordered it. When Volgarten told visitors to stay on the path, he was standing inside a chain of consequences that began with shortages in 1944. Mine detectors pushed armies to rely on metal signatures, so the metal was removed. Industry ran short of steel and other strategic material, so the burden shifted onto glass, cardboard, wood, and the bare minimum of metal around the fuse. The battlefield learned how people searched, then rewrote itself to slip between their instruments. The weapons that worked best were often the ones people later tried hardest to ban or bury. The most effective hacks did not overpower the system. They stepped around it. You can hear that in Volgarten's job. He was not a soldier in a firefight. He was a ranger in a national park, managing trails, boundaries, and public trust. Yet his authority rested on the same admission wartime sappers had to make. There are places where your machine cannot promise safety. Once that is true, the landscape changes. A meadow stops being a meadow. A shortcut stops being a shortcut. Every unmarked patch becomes a negotiation with an old design. There was another cruelty in the glass mine. If it detonated, the fragments were not just destructive, they were awkward evidence. Metal shows up clearly. Glass does not always cooperate the same way, especially in older medical workflows. The stealth did not end in the ground. It could follow the victim into treatment. The mine hid from the searcher, and its fragments could hide from the people trying to repair the damage afterward. The object feels cold, even by wartime standards, not because it was technically elegant, because it was technically sufficient. A glass vessel, a thin plate, a common charge. A pressure threshold in the range of a human step. No theatrics, no dramatic silhouette. Just enough engineering to make a detector hesitate and a path unsafe. By 2009, Roland Volgarten's warning sounded almost mundane. Stay on the marked route. Do not wander into the woods. It had the tone of park management, liability, procedure, public safety language. Under that calm instruction sat an older fact. This forest had once been seeded with devices built to evade the normal way humans looked for danger. The official story after wars says battlefields are cleared, borders are redrawn, parks are opened, and ordinary life resumes. Vogelsang was public again. The warning signs were still there. A 1944 workaround had not left the ground. Number 3. S-Mine 35 Bounding Anti-Personnel Mine. On June 6, 1944, inland from Utah Beach, men of the 237th Engineer Combat Battalion moved behind bulldozers and assault troops into ground the Germans had already prepared for them. Rommel's Atlantic Wall was built to turn the first minutes after landing into disorder. The minefields were part of that design. Somewhere ahead sat a German S-Mine 35, 5 inches high, 4 inches across, about 9 pounds, small enough to disappear in grass or loose soil. Popular memory turned it into a horror prop. Step on it, freeze, lift your boot, and die. Clean, instant, cinematic. The evidence points somewhere colder. Start with the mechanism. The S-Mine was not built to kill one man standing directly on top of it. It was built to hit the people around him. A pressure igniter could function at about 15 pounds, enough for a foot, a knee, or a careless hand during clearing. When triggered, the mine did not simply explode underground like an ordinary buried charge. A small propelling charge fired first and kicked the body upward. Then, at roughly 3 to 5 feet off the ground, it burst in the air, where flesh is. Legs, groin, belly. That was the geometry. Dirt absorbs, air does not. The movie version gets the sequence wrong. The victim was not pinning the explosion down with his weight like some tragic switch in a war film. U.S. War Department reporting on the SMIZ-35 igniter gave the tested delay as about 3.9 seconds to launch, then another 0.6 seconds to burst. Long enough to hear or feel the click. Long enough to understand what you touched. Not long enough to do much that mattered. Then came the burst itself. Approximately 360 steel balls, rods, or scrap fragments were packed between the inner body and outer casing. Not accidental shrapnel. Preloaded fragments, placed there on purpose. When the casing opened, it threw them sideways, horizontally, across the height where a man is hardest to save in the field. The S-Mine was not really a buried bomb. It was a low-altitude fragmentation charge hidden in the ground. That explains why it appears so often in accounts as more than a casualty producer. Anti-personnel mines can deny ground. This one denied confidence. A ditch was no longer cover. A beach exit was no longer an exit. A narrow lane through wire was no longer relief. The ground let men in, then struck when they began moving again. At Utah Beach, the U.S. 12th Infantry Regiment recorded 69 casualties, nearly all attributed to S-mines. The number matters, but only so far. Allied records usually tracked casualties by unit, date, and action, not always by the exact device that tore a man open. The full burden of the S-mine across the war is still hard to pin down with forensic neatness. The production figures show what Germany thought of it. More than 1,930,000 S-mines were produced between the mid-1930s and 1945. Nobody makes numbers like that for a gimmick. The screen version survives because it gives the victim one last choice. Stay still. Do not move. Maybe you live. The manuals describe something else. Once the igniter functioned, the sequence was already underway. The horror was not paralysis. It was comprehension. A man got a fragment of a second of understanding about his own injury before the weapon finished its work. Picture the real scene. One man alone in an empty field. A lane is being cleared under pressure. Men are stacked behind one another. Engines are running. Somebody is shouting. Somebody is searching for the next safe step. Then the mine goes off in its own order. First, the sound beneath you. Then the body of the mine jumps. Then everyone nearby enters the target area. The blast does not stay with the man who triggered it. It reaches the medic, the buddy reaching in, the engineer trying to keep the route open. The myth imagines a duel between one man and one mine. The S-mine was designed to attack a group. It punished spacing. It punished rescue. It punished the instinct to close distance when somebody got hit. In that sense, it fit the Atlantic Wall perfectly. The point was not merely to kill at the shoreline. The point was to break rhythm so that every delay multiplied every other defense. Read it that way, and the larger pattern comes into focus. The weapons that worked best were often the ones armies later tried hardest to ban or bury. Some devices do more than wound bodies. They alter behavior at once. They make trained men move badly. They make organized units bunch up, hesitate, detour, or expose themselves. The battlefield effect starts before the casualty is even counted. Its afterlife says the same thing. Germany did not keep the idea to itself. Post-war American M16 bounding mines and Soviet OZM series mines carried the same lesson forward. If a mine can rise into the air before detonation, it does not have to rely on blast underfoot. It can spread fragments where human bodies are actually built to bleed. Nations condemned these weapons, studied them, and copied the concept anyway. Not an accident. It is a confession. Still, the evidence matters more than the legend. Casualty radius figures vary by source. Explosive filling weights vary too. Memory enlarges notorious weapons, and soldiers who survived them had every reason to describe them in the darkest possible terms. The core facts stay steady across the technical descriptions. Small cylinder, pressure or trip activation, propelling charge, short delay, airburst at torso height. Roughly 360 fragments, enough metal moving sideways to turn a footpath into a machine for stripping away initiative. There is one more reason the S-mine stayed in memory more vividly than many deadlier systems. Artillery kills at distance. Mortars come from above. Even a buried blast mine can feel faceless. The S-mine made itself personal. It announced itself first. Men heard the mechanism begin, a click under pressure, a short mechanical pause. Then the jump. Not enough time to escape. Enough time to know the ground had chosen you. So no, it was not the neat movie device where lifting your foot sealed your fate. The real design was more controlled than that, and worse because of it. It was a timed ambush buried in the soil, built not to hold one man in place, but to catch him and everyone near him at the height of a human body. In the lanes off Utah Beach, where engineers were trying to turn chaos into movement, that small delay produced one of the quietest sounds in war, a man realizing what he had just stepped on. Number 2. Soviet anti-tank dogs. Years later, the number would not stay still. Some Soviet-linked summaries claimed 192 tanks. Others pushed the total to 300, even 304. Archival fragments gave smaller scenes instead. One unit, one date, one report, one field outside a city already burning. The spread matters. It shows what kind of weapon this was. Not clean enough to measure neatly, but real enough that officers kept writing it down. The numbers turn ugly here because the weapon had 4 legs. Start with the charge. 12 kilograms of TNT. Not a shell, not a mine buried in the earth. 12 kilograms strapped to a living animal in a harness with a projecting detonator. The dog was never meant to carry explosives to a tank and come back. That part of the legend is wrong. In the combat version, the dog was the delivery system and the fuse. It ran under the hull. The lever struck the underside. The charge detonated under the belly where armor was thinner. It sounds brutally simple. On a battlefield, simple is not the same as controllable. Now the range. Soviet instructions described 100 to 150 meters as the most effective launch distance. Broader descriptions stretched that to 200. The handler was not sending the dog across a field from safety. He was already close enough to see the tank clearly, close enough to judge direction, close enough to be under machine gun fire if the crew spotted movement. 100 meters sounds like space until you put a tank inside it. Then it becomes almost nothing. Theory says distance. The field says a football length between a man and a machine coming at him. On August 24, 1942, one of these units was folded into the defense of Stalingrad. 28th Independent Dog Tank Destroyer Group became operationally subordinate to the 10th NKVD Rifle Division. Strength, 202 men. 202 dogs. The symmetry feels administrative, almost tidy. One handler for one animal. One living weapon for one soldier expected to release it. The date matters more. Late August 1942. Stalingrad. This was not a laboratory phase, not a pre-war curiosity kept alive by eccentric officers. By then, the front was short of reliable anti-armor weapons. Anything that could get under a tank was worth fielding in strength. By October 1st, Division Commander Alexander Sarayev sent a report to General Vasily Chuikov's 62nd Army. That report credited the group with destroying or damaging 30 enemy tanks during the defense of the city. Not 300. Not a legend swollen over decades. 30, fixed to a date and a chain of command. Even that number needs caution. Wartime kill claims always do. Smoke, overlapping fire, disabled versus destroyed. Wrecks counted twice by different observers. All of that is real. But caution cuts both ways. Inflated numbers are common in war. Completely fictional systems do not keep surfacing in operational reports at the exact points where the front is collapsing and armor is pressing in. Take the most specific scene. September 13, 1942, near the Stalingrad airfield. Sarayev's report singled out Senior Sergeant Fedor Kryukov. 20 handlers under his command, bombing overhead, tanks attacking. In that action, the group was credited with destroying 13 tanks. Then, according to the report, they died in place. The line is short, but it gives you the whole scene. The launch distance was short. The air was full of blast and noise. Handlers could not simply release the dogs and withdraw. This was close combat with a fuse that breathed. Here, the usual version of the story starts to crack. The neat version says the dogs were a farce. They ran under Soviet tanks because they had trained on the wrong engines or the wrong fuel smell. The whole idea collapsed on contact with reality. There is truth inside that. Training problems were plausible. Battlefield confusion was guaranteed. Frightened animals do not obey doctrine. But the clean debunking is too clean. Soviet reports and later summaries place anti-tank dogs not in one embarrassing episode, but across multiple battles, around Moscow, at Stalingrad, at Kursk, and even later in the war. Not everywhere, not in neat numbers, but enough to leave a paper trail. The forensic picture is not comedy. It is inconsistency. 12 kilograms of TNT is enough to matter. A 100-meter release distance is close enough to kill the handler. A unit of 202 men and 202 dogs is too large to dismiss as rumor. A report dated October 1st, 1942 to Chwikov's army is too formal to wave away as barracks myth. The total results, though, remain unstable. Roughly 192 tanks in some summaries, roughly 304 in others, scattered archival episodes underneath. That is what a weapon born in desperation looks like. Visible enough to frighten, documented enough to survive, unreliable enough that no one could count it cleanly. You can feel that instability in the mechanics. For it to work, the dog had to leave cover, cross open ground, ignore blast and gunfire, identify the moving target, and get far enough under the chassis for the detonator to catch. Each part could fail. This is why any success is hard to fake completely. Tanks do not get holed underneath by accident in the middle of an assault. Officers do not assign 202 men to a fraud when armor is already at the city edge. But every failure was public, grotesque, and impossible to hide. That helped make the weapon infamous, not because it never worked, because sometimes it did. Armies do not like to preserve that part, not the absurdity, the arithmetic. When conventional anti-tank capacity falls short, the battlefield starts accepting equations that would have seemed unthinkable months earlier. One dog, one harness, 12 kilograms, one release at 100 meters. Maybe a miss, maybe panic. Maybe a tank disabled in exactly the place crews fear most. This was not innovation in any heroic sense. It was a front line solving a mechanical problem by spending living things until the numbers stopped moving. The anti-tank dog was not a myth, and it was not a joke. On Soviet paper, it killed enough tanks to be reported. In the field, it failed often enough to become a byword. Both are true at once. The hardest fact survives the argument. September 13, 1942, near the Stalingrad airfield. 20 handlers were credited with 13 tanks. Then they died where they stood. Number 1. Unit 731, Plague-Infected Flea Bombs. On the afternoon of October 27, 1940, a Japanese aircraft came in low over Kaiming Street in Ningbo, a port in Zhejiang still moving wartime supplies, and dropped something that did not look like a weapon at all. Grain, cotton, sand, and fleas carrying plague. There was no crater, no fireball, no shattered masonry for the next day's paper. If the later reconstructions are right, that was exactly the idea. This device did not need blast damage. It needed hungry people in a city at war to do familiar things. Run out, pick things up, carry them home, shake out the cloth, sweep the grain, feed the rats, and let the fleas do the rest. Follow the consequences. Within days, people around Kaiming Street began dying of bubonic plague. Ningbo officials did not respond with air defenses or bomb disposal teams because there was nothing obvious left to disarm. They isolated the sick. They sealed off the district. Later accounts say they built an isolation wall 4.3 meters high around the epidemic zone. When that still was not enough, they burned part of Kaiming Street itself. That is the clearest test of whether a weapon was used, not what the attacker claimed, but what the city was forced to do afterward. The delivery system was twisted in a very practical way. A normal bomb kills by force. This one handed the force over to human behavior. Unit 731 and the Nanjing-based Unit 1644 are the names most often linked to the Ningbo attack. Their problem was technical before it was moral. Fleas are fragile. Pathogens are fragile. A metal casing and a strong explosive charge can sterilize the very payload you are trying to spread. Japanese biological warfare work answered that with ceramic. Porcelain casings. Less heat, less violence at the moment of burst. Enough to scatter living vectors without cooking them. The Unit 731 Museum in Harbin says roughly 2,000 ceramic bombs were produced between 1937 and 1942. That number turns Ningbo from a nightmare anecdote into something industrial. Not one evil improvisation, a weapons program. The design grew smarter in the worst way. Medical reviews note that simply dispersing infected material from clay vessels was less effective on its own, so food became part of the logic. Grain was not accidental camouflage. Grain changed what happened after impact. Picture Kaiming Street in late 1940. Supplies are tight. Something falls from the sky, and instead of twisted metal, you see scattered food and cloth. You do not recoil. You step toward it. You scoop it up. You carry it in your hands, on your sleeves, through your doorway. The bomb hits once. The city carries it the rest of the way, house to house. That helps explain why this sits at the top of the list. Most forbidden field hacks try to get around a rule, a shortage, or a technical limit. This got around the battlefield itself. There was no trench line to breach, no bunker to crack, no tank to stop. A crowded civilian street became the active phase of the munition. It also points back to the larger problem behind the whole video. The weapons that worked best were often the ones states tried hardest to ban or bury. The more effective they were, the less anyone wanted to say out loud what effective meant. The numbers from Ningbo are ugly, and they do not line up neatly. Medical reconstruction gives 112 deaths with a 68% case fatality rate in the documented outbreak. Another account gives 135 dead by December 1940. Then there is the largest figure, tied in later retellings to Unit 731 Dr. Junichi Kaneko's doctoral thesis. 1,554 deaths, counting first and second round infections. That gap matters. It is the difference between a lethal local outbreak and a cascading urban disaster. But even the smallest number is enough to show what the weapon did. Cities do not build a 4.3-meter wall and burn a neighborhood because of rumor. The most human evidence is much smaller than any of those totals. In November 1940, a child named Hu Shanzhong later recalled losing his parents, his brother, and his sister within 10 days. He was a second-grade pupil. He remembered 3 black coffins and not knowing which one held his father. That is what biological attack hides behind statistics. Not the blast radius, but the delay. Not impact, but incubation. By the time the deaths arrive, the airplane is gone. The street has been swept. The cause has already blurred into ordinary life. That delay made the weapon hard to count cleanly and easy to bury politically. If 112 died, it was still mass murder by infection. If 135 died by December, the outbreak had already outrun the moment of attack. If 1,554 died, including secondary infections, then the real bomb was no longer only the one dropped over Ningbo. It was every rat, every flea, every human contact after that. The payload was not best measured in kilograms, it was measured in transmission chains. A shell kills where it lands. A plague flea bomb tries to make the target finish the job. It recruits hunger. It recruits scavenging. It recruits walls, sick rooms, funeral processions, and the ordinary movement of a city under stress. Even the evidence of success resists easy military storytelling. Too slow for battlefield glory. Too civilian for clean military history. Too monstrous to preserve proudly. What remains comes in fragments: a port street, a burned district, a disputed death toll, a child staring at 3 coffins. By the time later generations argued over the exact number, the mechanism was already plain. On October 27, 1940, the bomb did not explode into death. It slipped into daily life, and daily life carried it farther than any blast could. My parents, brother, and sister all died within 10 days.